Oil stains covered the concrete floor of David's repair shop, like abstract art painted by years of mechanical work. The smell of metal polish and electric circuits filled the air while sparks flew from his welding torch as he fixed a broken cooling unit for Mrs. Patterson's apartment. New Geneva Station buzzed with activity outside his small workshop. But inside the cramped space filled with spare parts and half-finished projects, David found the peace that had escaped him since leaving military service 3 years ago. The welding torch hissed as he sealed the final joint on the cooling unit. David lifted his protective mask and wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his gloved hand. At 32, he had learned to appreciate the simple satisfaction of fixing things that others had given up on. Unlike his years in the Frontier Defense Forces where everything seemed designed to break people rather than repair them, his workshop on the outer rim of human space offered something rare, the chance to make things work again. A soft chime announced someone entering his shop. David set down his tools and turned toward the door, expecting to see another station resident with a broken appliance or maybe a ship captain needing emergency repairs. Instead, a small figure stood hesitantly in the doorway, clutching something against her chest with both arms. The visitor was clearly not human. Her skin showed the telltale shimmer of scales that caught the workshop's fluorescent lights, creating patterns of blue and silver across her arms and face. 2 small horns protruded from her forehead, and her eyes held the vertical pupils characteristic of the dragon-descended species that occasionally visited the station. But what struck David most was her age. She could not have been more than 8 or 9 years old by human standards. Though he knew alien aging worked differently, the girl stepped forward on unsteady legs, her scaled hands trembling as she held what David now recognized as the remains of a stuffed animal. The toy had once been a bear, but time and damage had reduced it to little more than torn fabric and loose stuffing. One arm hung by a few threads, the head tilted at an unnatural angle, and several holes had allowed most of the filling to escape. "Please," the girl said in heavily accented standard, the common language used throughout this sector of space. "You fix things, yes? Can you fix him?" David knelt down to bring himself to eye level with his young visitor. Up close, he could see that her scales had lost some of their natural luster, suggesting poor nutrition or stress. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of too many sleepless nights, and her clothes, while clean, showed the careful mending that came from having very little. "What's your name?" David asked gently. "Lyra," she replied, then added quickly, "I have money. Not much, but I can pay." She reached into a small pouch tied to her belt and produced a handful of low-denomination credits, probably worth less than the cost of David's morning coffee. The sight of her carefully counted coins made something twist in his chest. He had seen that same desperate hope in the eyes of refugees during the border conflicts, people clinging to whatever small treasures remained from their former lives. "This bear must be pretty special," David said, accepting the damaged toy from her hands. Lyra's eyes filled with tears that she blinked away quickly. "He was my mother's when she was small, then mine. Mother said he would always keep me safe, but—" She gestured helplessly at the toy's condition. David examined the bear more carefully. The fabric was an unusual material, softer than anything produced by human manufacturers and woven with threads that seemed to shift color slightly in different light. The craftsmanship was exquisite, showing attention to detail that spoke of deep love and care in its creation. Whatever had happened to damage it so severely must have been traumatic. "Where is your mother now?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the pain in Lyra's voice. "She died last year. Sickness." Lyra's voice became very small. "The bear got hurt when we had to leave our old home fast. I tried to fix him myself, but I made it worse." David's hand stilled on the damaged toy. He knew about losing parents young, about having to leave home in a hurry, about trying to fix things that seemed beyond repair. The workshop suddenly felt too quiet, filled only with the distant hum of the station's life support systems and the soft sound of Lyra's breathing. "I'm not really a toy repair person," David admitted. "I usually fix machines and electronics." Lyra's face fell, but before she could speak, David continued. "But fixing things is fixing things, right? Let me see what I can do." The transformation in the girl's expression was immediate. Hope blazed in her vertical pupils like stars coming out after a long night. She watched eagerly as David carried the bear to his main workbench. and began laying out tools he had never used for this purpose. Before working on the bear required a completely different approach than his usual mechanical repairs. Instead of circuit boards and metal components, David found himself dealing with delicate fabric and synthetic stuffing. He had to learn as he went, using small needles instead of welding torches, thread instead of solder. His large hands, trained for heavy mechanical work, had to become gentle and precise. Lyra remained in the shop while he worked, perched on a stool near the workbench. She did not speak much, but David could feel her watching every stitch he made. Occasionally, she would offer quiet suggestions about how the bear had looked before, or point out a detail he might have missed. As the hours passed, the bear slowly returned to life under David's careful attention. He reinforced the weak seams, replaced the damaged stuffing with material salvaged from packing supplies, and painstakingly reattached the loose arm. The most challenging part was the head, which required complete reconstruction of the neck joint while maintaining the bear's original expression. When David finally set down his needle and thread, the late afternoon light was streaming through the workshop's windows. The bear sat upright on the workbench, looking almost exactly as it must have when new. The unusual fabric had responded well to cleaning, regaining much of its original luster, and David's careful stitching was nearly invisible. Lyra stared at the restored toy for several seconds without speaking. Then she reached out with trembling hands and lifted the bear, hugging it tight against her chest. The tears she had been holding back all day finally came, but now they were tears of joy rather than grief. "Thank you," she whispered into the bear's fur. "Thank you so much." David waved away the credits she tried to give him. "Keep your money. Buy yourself a good meal instead." As Lyra headed toward the door, clutching her restored treasure, she turned back with a bright smile that seemed to light up the entire workshop. "You are very kind. Other would have liked you." After she left, David cleaned up his workspace and tried to return to his normal routine. But something had changed in the quiet shop. For the first time since leaving military service, he felt that his work had accomplished something truly important. He had not just repaired a toy, he had restored a little girl's connection to her mother and given her back a piece of hope. That night, as he locked up the workshop and headed to his small apartment, David could not shake the image of Lyra's grateful smile. He had no way of knowing that their simple interaction had been observed, recorded, and would soon attract attention from forces far beyond the peaceful borders of New Geneva Station. 3 weeks after fixing Lyra's bear, David discovered that good deeds spread faster than station gossip. His small repair shop now bustled with customers from species he had never seen before, each bringing their own broken treasures and mechanical puzzles. Word had traveled through the alien quarters that the human mechanic would tackle any repair job with patience and fair prices. A family of crystalline beings had brought him their shattered meditation sphere. 2 fungal creatures needed their atmospheric processor repaired. Even a group of floating gas entities had somehow managed to convey that their containment unit needed calibration. David found himself learning new technologies every day, adapting his human engineering knowledge to work with alien designs that followed completely different principles. Lyra had become his most frequent visitor. She appeared every few days, sometimes bringing small repair jobs from her neighbors, sometimes just watching him work while clutching her restored bear. David learned that she lived in the station's refugee quarter with other displaced persons, surviving on basic assistance credits and whatever odd jobs she could find despite her young age. Today she sat cross-legged on the floor near his workbench, carefully sorting screws and bolts while David struggled with a particularly stubborn power converter. The device belonged to an elderly alien trader who needed it fixed before his next supply run. David had been working on it for 2 hours and sweat soaked through his work shirt despite the shop's climate control. "This thing is fighting me," David muttered, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. The converter's housing was designed for beings with very different hand structures, making it nearly impossible to reach the internal components with human tools. "Maybe if you take off the shirt," Lyra suggested. "You work better when you are not so hot." David paused, his hands still buried in the converter's mechanical depths. He usually kept his arms covered while working, a habit left over from military service. But the workshop was private, and Lyra was just a child who would not understand the significance of what she might see. He pulled off his sweat-soaked shirt and tossed it onto a nearby chair. The cooler air felt good against his skin as he returned to work on the stubborn converter. With better mobility and comfort, he finally managed to access the damaged power coupling and began the delicate process of replacing it. Behind him, Lyra gasped. David glanced over his shoulder to see the girl staring at his left shoulder with wide eyes. Her vertical pupils had dilated, and her scales had taken on a brighter shimmer that he had learned indicated strong emotion in her species. "Lyra? What's wrong?" The young dragon girl slid off her makeshift seat and approached him slowly, her gaze fixed on his shoulder. David looked down at himself, confused, then remembered what she was seeing. The Griffin tattoo covered most of his left shoulder and upper arm. The mythical creature was rendered in black and gray ink, its eagle head proud and fierce, its lion, body coiled with power, and its spread wings seeming to move in the workshop's shifting light. David had gotten the tattoo during his military service as a tribute to his squadron's mascot. They had called themselves the Griffin Company, and the tattoo was a way to carry his fallen comrades with him always. But Lyra's reaction was unlike anything he had expected. She dropped to one knee beside his workbench, her head bowed in what looked like reverence. "Lyra, what are you doing? Get up." "You bear the mark," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You carry the Griffin's sign." David set down his tools and turned to face her fully. "It's just a tattoo, kid. A picture on my skin. It doesn't mean anything special." Lyra raised her head, and David was startled to see tears in her eyes. "On my homeworld, the Griffin is sacred. Our oldest stories tell of great protectors who bore the Griffin's mark, warriors who defended the innocent and stood against darkness. I thought they were just legends." "They are just legends," David said gently. "And this is just a tattoo I got to remember my friends. Please stand up." But Lyra remained kneeling. "The stories say that those marked by the Griffin appear when they are most needed. They come from distant places to help those who cannot help themselves." She looked up at him with shining eyes. "You fixed my bear when no one else would. You help everyone who comes to you, no matter what they can pay." The stories were true. David felt deeply uncomfortable with her reverence. He reached down and gently helped her to her feet. "I'm just a mechanic, Lyra. I fix things because that's what I'm good at, not because of some ancient prophecy. But the mark is ink under my skin, nothing more." David pulled his shirt back on, covering the tattoo. "Don't make me into something I'm not." Lyra nodded, but David could see that his words had not changed her mind. For the rest of the afternoon, she treated him with a newfound deference that made him increasingly uneasy. She spoke more formally, insisted on helping with tasks she had previously left to him, and watched him with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for authority figures. When she finally left that evening, David sat alone in his workshop and stared at his covered shoulder. The Griffin tattoo had been with him for 8 years, a personal memorial to friends lost in humanity's expansion conflicts. He had never imagined it could hold religious significance for an alien species. Over the following days, David noticed that word of the tattoo had spread through the station's alien community. Some of his customers now looked at him differently, with a mixture of curiosity and respect that he found disturbing. A few even asked to see the mark, requests he politely declined. What David did not know was that his shop had been under surveillance for the past week. High above the station, automated observation drones monitored daily life with the casual efficiency of advanced technology. The drones belonged to no human authority. New Geneva Station was too remote and insignificant to warrant that level of attention from Earth's government. Instead, the watchers came from a different source entirely. The Draconic Empire maintained surveillance networks throughout this sector of space, keeping watch on border activities and potential threats to Imperial interests. Most of the time, the drones simply recorded routine data that was filed away and forgotten. But when David removed his shirt that afternoon, the surveillance system's recognition protocols triggered an immediate alert. The Griffin tattoo was not just clearly visible, it was photographed, analyzed, and flagged for priority review. Within hours, the image had been transmitted across space to Imperial intelligence services. In the vast database of the Draconic Empire, Griffins were not mythical protectors. They were ancient enemies, symbols of resistance that had been banned from Imperial space for over 1,000 years. According to Imperial law, anyone bearing the Griffin's mark was to be reported immediately to the highest levels of government. As David worked late into the evening, unaware of the electronic eyes watching him, the first intelligence reports were already being compiled. His simple act of removing a sweaty shirt had set in motion events that would soon bring the attention of the most powerful being in the galaxy directly to his small repair shop on the edge of nowhere. The Griffin tattoo, which David saw as a memorial to fallen friends and Lyra saw as a mark of prophecy, represented something entirely different to Imperial observers. To them, it was a declaration of war against everything the Draconic Empire represented. In the morning, David would wake up and open his shop as usual, expecting another normal day of fixing broken things and helping his neighbors. He had no way of knowing that powerful forces were already moving, that his peaceful life on New Geneva Station was about to end, and that the Griffin mark he carried would soon determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone he had come to care about. The surveillance drones continued their silent watch, recording every movement, every customer interaction, every moment when the tattoo might become visible again. In the depths of space, a report was being prepared for an emperor who had not shown personal interest in border intelligence for over a decade. Everything was about to change, and it all began with a young girl's reverence for an ancient symbol and a mechanic's decision to stay cool while working in his shop. Deep in the heart of Imperial space, the massive dreadnought Stellar Dominion drifted through the void like a mountain of metal and menace. The ship stretched for 30 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull bristling with weapons that could reduce entire planets to molten slag. Within its armored depths, 1,000,000 beings worked to maintain the vessel that served as both palace and fortress for the most feared ruler in the galaxy. Emperor Voss sat in his private study, a chamber carved from a single block of black stone and illuminated by floating crystals that cast shifting shadows across the walls. His scaled form filled the massive throne-like chair, each movement causing light to play across the deep crimson scales that marked him as royalty among the dragon-descended species. Ancient and powerful beyond measure, Voss had ruled the Draconic Empire for 3 centuries, expanding its borders through conquest and maintaining order through fear. Usually, the emperor spent his mornings reviewing reports from his military commanders and provincial governors. Border surveillance data was handled by lower-level intelligence officers and rarely reached his attention. But today, his chief advisor had marked one particular file as requiring Imperial review. The holographic display activated at Voss's gesture, showing surveillance footage from New Geneva Station. The Emperor's yellow eyes narrowed as he watched the grainy recording of a human male working in what appeared to be a repair shop. The footage was routine until the human removed his shirt, revealing the tattoo that had triggered every alarm in the Imperial intelligence network. Voss leaned forward, his claws scraping against the stone armrest of his chair. The Griffin tattoo was unmistakable. The eagle head, the lion body, the spread wings that seemed to mock Imperial authority even from across the galaxy. For over 1,000 years, the Griffin had been the symbol of resistance against draconic rule. It had flown on the banners of rebel armies, been carved into the walls of besieged cities, and appeared in the dreams of those who dared to oppose Imperial expansion. "Bring me the file on this human," Voss commanded. His aide, a nervous functionary named Kale, activated a datapad with trembling hands. The subject's name is David Chen, age 32, former military service in Humanity's Frontier Defense Forces. He operates a repair business on New Geneva Station and has no apparent political affiliations. "No political affiliations," the Emperor repeated slowly. "Yet he bears the mark of our ancient enemies." Voss gestured for additional footage and the hologram shifted to show David interacting with various alien customers. The Emperor watched with growing interest as the human worked patiently with species that most humans treated with suspicion or fear. Of particular note was his repeated interactions with a young dragon girl. "Who is the child?" Voss asked. Kale consulted his datapad nervously. "Unknown, Your Majesty. She appears to be a refugee living in the station's alien quarter. Intelligence suggests she may be of dragon descent, but we have no official records." The Emperor's eyes blazed as he watched David return the repaired toy to the grateful child. Such kindness toward dragonkind was virtually unheard of among humans, who generally viewed all draconic species with suspicion stemming from centuries of border conflicts. "Your Majesty," Kale ventured, "the human appears to be unaware of the tattoo's significance. Perhaps this is merely coincidence?" Voss turned his full attention to his aide, and Kale immediately regretted speaking. The Emperor's gaze could freeze blood in veins and had been known to drive lesser beings to madness. "Coincidence?" Voss said softly. "A human bearing the Griffin's mark appears on our border, shows unprecedented kindness to our people, and you suggest coincidence?" I meant no disrespect, Your Majesty." Voss turned back to the holographic display, where the footage showed David carefully repairing a delicate alien device, with the same attention he had given to the child's toy. "The ancient prophecies speak of a time when the Griffin mark would appear again," the Emperor said, more to himself than to Kale. "They claimed that its bearer would either herald the Empire's greatest triumph or its ultimate destruction." Kale remained silent, knowing that any response might be interpreted as questioning Imperial wisdom. Voss stood and walked to the chamber's viewport, gazing out at the stars that marked the boundaries of his vast domain. 3 centuries of rule had taught him that the most dangerous threats often appeared in the most innocent forms. A simple mechanic on a remote station might seem harmless, but history was full of examples where small acts of defiance had grown into movements that toppled empires. "Prepare a reconnaissance mission," Voss ordered. "I want detailed surveillance of this New Geneva station. Send our best intelligence operatives." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Should they apprehend the human?" "Not yet. I want to understand what we are dealing with. This David Chen may be nothing more than an ignorant human with unfortunate body art, or he may be something far more significant." Over the following week, Imperial intelligence operatives began arriving at New Geneva Station. They came disguised as traders, tourists, and refugees, blending into the station's diverse population while maintaining constant surveillance of David's repair shop. Every customer interaction was recorded and analyzed. Every word David spoke was captured and transmitted back to Imperial intelligence. The operatives noted David's unusual technical abilities, his seemingly instinctive understanding of alien technologies, and his reputation for helping anyone regardless of their ability to pay. They recorded his interactions with the Dragon Girl and observed the reverence with which many alien customers treated him. But what concerned Imperial intelligence most was the subtle changes occurring throughout the station. David's kindness was inspiring others to similar acts of compassion. Humans who had previously avoided alien quarters were beginning to venture there on errands of aid. Species that had traditionally been suspicious of each other were working together on community projects. Small acts of cooperation were creating ripples of unity that spread throughout the station's population. To Imperial observers, trained to see resistance movements in their earliest stages, these developments were deeply troubling. Unity between species had historically led to organized opposition to draconic rule. Cooperation between humans and dragons was especially dangerous, as it suggested the possibility of alliance between 2 of the galaxy's most militarily capable species. The daily intelligence reports painted a picture of a human who was either incredibly naive or incredibly dangerous. David appeared genuinely unaware of his tattoo's significance, yet his actions consistently aligned with the values that the Griffin symbol had historically represented. He protected the weak, helped the desperate, and treated all beings with equal dignity regardless of their species or status. Emperor Voss read each report with growing fascination. The more he learned about David Chen, the more convinced he became that this was no mere coincidence. The Griffin mark had appeared at a time when Imperial expansion was facing increasing resistance from human colonies. A symbol of unity and hope was emerging, just when the Empire needed to maintain division and fear among its subjects. "Prepare my personal fleet," Voss finally commanded after reading the latest intelligence summary. "I will investigate this matter personally." Kyle's scales paled to nearly white. "Your Majesty, surely such a minor matter does not require Imperial attention." "A minor matter?" Voss's voice carried a dangerous edge. "The Griffin's mark has returned to the galaxy for the first time in 1,000 years, and you call it minor." "Of course not, Your Majesty. I only meant—" "You meant nothing because you understand nothing." Voss stood and began pacing, his massive form causing the deck plates to vibrate with each step. Every great change in galactic history has begun with seemingly small events. A mechanic fixing a child's toy, a human showing kindness to dragons, a tattoo revealed in a moment of carelessness. The Emperor stopped pacing and fixed Kale with a stare that promised terrible consequences for any further stupidity. If this David Chen is truly just an ignorant human with poor taste in body art, then I will deal with him quickly and return to more important matters. But if he represents something more, Voss's claws extended slightly, scraping against the stone floor, then I will crush this threat before it can grow beyond my ability to control. Within hours, the Imperial fleet began preparing for departure. The Stellar Dominion and its escort vessels would travel to New Geneva Station under the pretense of a routine border inspection. No one outside the Emperor's inner circle would know the real reason for the visit. As the massive ships moved through hyperspace toward their destination, David continued his work in blissful ignorance of the approaching storm. He repaired broken devices, helped his neighbors, and treated the Dragon Girl with the same kindness he showed to all his customers. The Griffin tattoo remained hidden beneath his work clothes, but its discovery had already set in motion events that would soon test everything David believed about himself and his place in the galaxy. The most powerful ruler in known space was coming to judge whether a simple mechanic represented hope or threat, salvation or destruction. The answer would determine not just David's fate, but the future of human-dragon relations throughout the galaxy. Something was wrong at New Geneva Station, and David's military instincts screamed warnings that he could not ignore. Over the past week, he had noticed too many coincidences for comfort. New faces appeared in the marketplace, lingering near his shop without buying anything. Unfamiliar ships docked at the station's ports, their crews speaking in hushed tones and asking casual questions about the local population. The normally relaxed atmosphere of the border station had acquired an undercurrent of tension that reminded David of pre-combat conditions during his military service. He stood at his workshop's window, watching the main corridor through the grimy glass while pretending to organize inventory. A group of well-dressed beings had passed his shop 3 times in the last hour, each time slowing to peer through the window before moving on. Their clothing was too expensive for typical station visitors, and their behavior too coordinated to be coincidental. The shop's door chimed, and David turned to see Lyra entering with her usual cautious smile. But today something was different about her as well. The young dragon girl moved with unusual nervousness, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if checking for followers. "Lyra," David said, keeping his voice casual. "How are you today?" "I am well," she replied, but her scales had taken on the dull coloration that indicated stress in her species. She clutched her repaired bear tightly against her chest and approached David's workbench with hesitant steps. "Are you sure? You seem worried about something." Lyra looked toward the window, then back at David. "There are new people at the station. They ask questions about you." David's blood chilled. "What kind of questions?" "About your business. About who comes to see you, about—" She gestured vaguely at his shoulder where the Griffin tattoo lay hidden beneath his work shirt. "About marks you might have." The pretense of normalcy crumbled in David's mind. His worst fears were being confirmed by a child who had inadvertently become involved in something far beyond her understanding. "Lyra, listen to me carefully. Those people who are asking questions, they could be dangerous. You need to stay away from them, and you need to stay away from my shop for a while." "No," the word burst from her with surprising force. "I will not leave you. The stories say, forget the stories." David's voice was sharper than he intended, and he saw Lyra flinch. He forced himself to speak more gently. "This isn't about ancient prophecies or Griffin marks. This is about real danger from real people who might want to hurt anyone connected to me." Lyra's vertical pupils dilated with emotion. "You do not understand. I cannot leave you because—" She struggled with the words as if revealing a terrible secret. "Because they are my people." David stared at her. "What do you mean, your people?" "The ones asking questions. They are from the Draconic Empire." Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper. "And so am I." The workshop suddenly felt too small and too quiet. David could hear his own heartbeat as he processed what Lyra had just revealed. "You're from the Empire, but you're a refugee. You said you had to leave your home because of sickness." "I am a refugee," Lyra said quickly, "but not from sickness. From politics." She set her bear on the workbench and looked up at David with eyes that seemed much older than her apparent age. My full name is Princess Lyra of the Eastern Provinces. My father is Emperor Voss. David felt the world shift beneath his feet. The dragon girl he had befriended, the child whose toy he had repaired out of simple kindness, was the daughter of the most powerful ruler in the galaxy. The implications hit him like physical blows. Your father is the Emperor, he said slowly. The Emperor who rules half the galaxy. The Emperor whose forces have been fighting humans for decades. Yes, Lyra's voice was barely audible. I spoke against his expansion policies. I said that conquering other species was wrong, that we should make peace instead of war. He called me naive and dangerous. When I would not change my views, he exiled me. David ran his hands through his hair, trying to process this revelation. So when his people started asking questions about me, they are here because of the Griffin mark. In our culture, it is forbidden. But also, Lyra reached into her small pouch and pulled out something David had never seen before, a tiny data crystal that glowed with internal light. The bear was not just a toy. It was a hiding place. She touched a hidden seam in the bear's back, and a small compartment opened to reveal several more crystals. These contain evidence of war crimes committed by Imperial forces, recordings of orders to destroy civilian populations, data about weapons testing on inhabited worlds. I took them when I fled, hoping someday they could be used to stop the killing. David stared at the innocent-looking bear that had held such dangerous secrets. You've been carrying evidence against your own father? He is not my father anymore, Lyra said with a firmness that belied her young appearance. A true father would not order the deaths of innocents. A true ruler would protect all his people, not just the ones who look like him. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made them both freeze. David moved to the window and saw a group of Imperial operatives approaching his shop. Their disguises were adequate for fooling casual observers, but David's military training allowed him to identify their coordinated movement patterns and concealed weapons. They're coming, he whispered. Lyra quickly sealed the crystals back inside, her bear, and clutched the toy against her chest. What do we do? David's mind raced through options. He could try to run, but there was nowhere on the station that would be safe from Imperial agents. He could try to fight, but he was one human against an unknown number of trained operatives. He could surrender and hope for mercy, but the Griffin tattoo marked him as an enemy of the Empire regardless of his intentions. David, Lyra said urgently, I'm sorry. I never meant to bring danger to you. I only wanted my bear fixed. Despite everything, David found himself smiling at the absurdity of the situation. A simple repair job had entangled him in galactic politics and put him on the wrong side of the most powerful military force in known space. It's not your fault, kid. Sometimes life just gets complicated. The footsteps stopped outside the shop door. David could see shadows moving beyond the frosted glass as the operatives took positions around the entrance. There's something else, Lyra said quickly. The Griffin mark. It really is special to our people. Not because of superstition, but because of history. 1,000 years ago, humans and dragons worked together to fight against tyranny. The Griffin was their symbol. My father fears its return because it represents the possibility of alliance between our species. The door chimed as the first operative entered the shop. He was tall and broad, with the characteristic scales and predatory grace of the Imperial military. His eyes immediately fixed on David, then shifted to Lyra with obvious recognition. Princess, the operative said with a formal bow. His Imperial Majesty has been searching for you. I am no longer a princess, Lyra replied with surprising dignity. I am just a refugee under the protection of the human David Chen. The operative's gaze returned to David, and his expression hardened. The human David Chen is under arrest by order of the Emperor. He will come with us immediately. Under arrest for what? David asked, though he already knew the answer. For bearing the forbidden mark, for harboring an Imperial fugitive, for crimes against the Draconic Empire. David looked down at Lyra, who stared back at him with eyes full of determination and fear. In that moment, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. I'm not going anywhere without her, David said. The operative's hand moved toward his concealed weapon. That was not a request, human. I know exactly what it was, David replied. And my answer is still no. More operatives entered the shop, surrounding David and Lyra. The peaceful workspace where David had fixed countless broken things was about to become a battleground. But for the first time since leaving military service, David felt completely certain about his choice. He would protect Lyra, just as he had promised to protect his comrades during the frontier wars. The Griffin tattoo on his shoulder might have brought this trouble upon them, but it also reminded him of what he stood for on defending those who could not defend themselves. The confrontation that followed would determine whether two unlikely friends could survive the attention of an empire, and whether the Griffin's return truly heralded a new chapter in the long history of conflict between humans and dragons. The main plaza of New Geneva Station had never hosted such a gathering. Thousands of beings from dozens of species filled the vast open space, their conversations creating a low murmur that echoed off the metal walls. Station security forces stood at nervous attention along the perimeter, their weapons uselessly small compared to the Imperial warships that now dominated the view through the plaza's massive transparent dome. David stood in the center of the crowd, flanked by Imperial guards whose presence made his skin crawl. His hands were bound with energy restraints that hummed with barely contained power, and every movement sent tingles of pain up his arms. Beside him, Lyra clutched her bear with desperate intensity, her scales dim with fear but her posture defiant. The plaza fell silent as Emperor Voss emerged from the station's administrative section. The ruler of the Draconic Empire was even more imposing in person than David had imagined from historical records. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, his crimson scales caught the light like polished armor, and his yellow eyes surveyed the crowd with the casual authority of absolute power. Every step he took seemed to make the deck plates vibrate, and beings throughout the plaza instinctively moved aside to create a clear path. Station Administrator Walsh, a nervous human bureaucrat who had clearly never expected to host galactic royalty, hurried alongside the Emperor while stammering apologies for the station's modest accommodations. Voss ignored him completely, his attention focused entirely on David. "So," the Emperor said, his voice carrying easily across the silent plaza, "you are the human who bears the Griffin's mark." David met the Emperor's gaze without flinching. "I'm David Chen. I fix things for a living." "How modest." Voss circled around David slowly, like a predator evaluating prey. "Tell me, David Chen who fixes things, do you know what your tattoo represents?" "A memorial to fallen friends." "Indeed. And did these friends share your charitable nature toward dragonkind?" David felt the trap being laid but could see no way to avoid it. They were good people who believed in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. How noble. Voss stopped directly in front of David, close enough that the human could feel the heat radiating from the Emperor's scaled skin. "Unfortunately, the mark you bear represents rebellion against Imperial authority. According to our laws, anyone displaying the Griffin symbol must face judgment." "I'm not a citizen of your empire," David said, "and this is a human station in neutral space." Voss smiled, revealing teeth that could easily crush bone. "Neutral space is a human concept. In reality, all space belongs to whoever has the power to claim it." He gestured toward the Imperial fleet visible through the dome. "Do you see anyone here capable of disputing my authority?" The crowd murmured uneasily. David could see fear in the faces around him. Beings who had come to the remote station seeking safety from exactly this kind of Imperial power play. "However," Voss continued, "I am not without mercy. You claim to be merely a simple mechanic who meant no offense. Very well, I will give you the opportunity to prove your innocence." Lyra stepped forward, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "Father, this human has done nothing wrong. Release him." The Emperor's expression hardened as he looked down at his daughter. "You forget yourself, child. You are no longer in a position to make demands." "I am in a position to tell the truth," Lyra replied. "David Chen has shown more honor and kindness than most of your nobles. He repaired my bear when no one else would help. He asks no payment from those who cannot afford it. He treats all beings with respect regardless of their species." "How touching," Voss said coldly. "Your protector has filled your head with naive ideals about universal brotherhood." He turned back to David. "But words are easily spoken. Actions reveal true character. Therefore I propose a test." Administrator Walsh cleared his throat nervously. "Your Imperial Majesty, surely we can resolve this matter through diplomatic channels." Voss silenced him with a glance that could have frozen plasma. "I will present you with 3 challenges," he said to David. "Complete them successfully, and both you and my wayward daughter will be granted safe passage to whatever destination you choose. Fail, and this entire station will answer for harboring enemies of the Empire. David felt the weight of thousands of lives settling on his shoulders. What kind of challenges? Tests appropriate for one who claims to fix broken things. Voss gestured, and his guards produced a series of objects that made David's heart sink. First, you will repair this. The object was clearly alien technology, but unlike anything David had ever seen. It resembled a crystalline sphere covered in what looked like organic circuitry, all of it damaged beyond recognition. The device pulsed weakly with internal light, suggesting it was still partially functional despite extensive trauma. This is a memory core from our most advanced starships, Voss explained. It has been damaged in battle and declared irreparable by our finest technicians. You have 1 hour. David examined the device with growing dread. The technology was centuries ahead of anything humans had developed, operating on principles he could barely comprehend. The organic circuits seemed to respond to his touch, but their purpose and interconnections were completely mysterious. I don't understand this technology, David admitted. Then you will fail, and these people will suffer for your inadequacy, Voss replied. Unless, of course, you wish to surrender now and accept summary execution. David looked around the plaza at the faces watching him. He saw fear, hope, and desperate trust in the expressions of beings who had become unwilling spectators to this deadly game. Lyra stood nearby, her scales bright with determination despite their impossible situation. I'll try, David said. The Emperor gestured to his guards, who set up a workstation in the center of the plaza. David was given basic tools and a portable scanner, then left alone with the damaged memory core while thousands watched in tense silence. The first few minutes were pure frustration. The device's organic circuits reacted unpredictably to his instruments, sometimes flaring with energy and sometimes going completely dark. David had to rely on intuition more than knowledge, following patterns that felt right even when he could not explain why. Gradually, he began to understand the device's structure. The organic circuits were not just conduits for energy, they were storage matrices that preserved information in living tissue. The damage had severed connections between memory segments, causing the stored data to become fragmented and inaccessible. Working carefully, David began reconnecting the severed pathways. He had to learn the device's logic as he worked, following the natural flow of its organic architecture. When conventional tools failed, he used techniques adapted from his work on biological systems, treating the memory core more like an injured creature than a broken machine. With 10 minutes remaining, the device suddenly blazed to life. The organic circuits synchronized their pulsing, and data streams began flowing between previously isolated segments. David had successfully restored a piece of technology that the Empire's best engineers had given up on. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Voss showed no emotion beyond mild interest. Impressive. Now for the second challenge. The guards brought forward a puzzle box covered in ancient draconic script. The device was clearly ceremonial, made from precious metals and decorated with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. This is the riddle of the ancestors, Voss explained. It has remained unsolved for over 2,000 years. Draconic scholars have spent lifetimes attempting to unlock its secrets. You have 30 minutes. David stared at the puzzle box with growing despair. Unlike the memory core, which operated on comprehensible principles despite its advanced technology, this device was rooted in cultural knowledge he could never possess. The script was unreadable, the symbols meaningless, and the mechanism completely opaque. But as he examined the box more closely, David realized that the solution might not require cultural understanding. The device was fundamentally a mechanical puzzle. The script and symbols were decorative elements overlaying a purely physical challenge. Ignoring the intimidating decorations, David focused on the box's structure. He found pressure points, sliding panels, and rotating elements that suggested a complex sequence of manipulations. The key was to think like an engineer rather than a scholar. Working methodically, David began testing different combinations of movements. Each correct action produced a subtle click and revealed new elements of the puzzle. The ancient device responded to logical thinking and mechanical intuition rather than cultural knowledge. With 5 minutes to spare, the final mechanism engaged. The puzzle box opened with a musical chime, revealing a crystal interior that glowed with soft light. The crowd gasped in amazement, but Voss remained unmoved. 2 successes, the Emperor said. But the final challenge will test more than your technical abilities. It will reveal the true nature of your character. The guard stepped aside, and Voss drew an ornate sword from his belt. The weapon gleamed with edge that looked sharp enough to cut through starship armor. "Single combat," Voss announced. "You against me. No weapons, no armor, no assistance. If you can land a single blow against my person, you win. If I defeat you," he smiled coldly, "well, that outcome should be obvious." David stared at the massive Emperor and felt his chances of survival plummet to 0. Voss was not only 3 times his size and covered in natural armor, but had centuries of combat experience and reflexes that could react faster than human thought. "This isn't a test," David said. "It's an execution." "Perhaps," Voss agreed, "but it is also an opportunity to prove that the Griffin's mark means something more than nostalgic decoration." David looked at Lyra, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. Around the plaza, thousands of beings waited to learn whether their lives would be forfeit because of one human's inability to defeat an emperor in single combat. "I accept," David said. As the Emperor raised his sword and the crowd held its collective breath, David realized that the real test had nothing to do with fighting skills or chances of victory. It was about standing up for what was right even when the odds were impossible, about protecting others even at the cost of his own life. The Griffin tattoo on his shoulder seemed to burn with phantom heat as David prepared to face the most powerful being in the galaxy, with nothing but courage and the desperate hope that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible could happen. The plaza had become an arena, with thousands of beings forming a circle around the open space where David faced Emperor Voss. The ruler of the Draconic Empire stood like a mountain of crimson scales and barely contained power, his ornate sword gleaming in the station's artificial light. David, unarmed and outmatched in every conceivable way, took a defensive stance and tried to calm his racing heart. "Before we begin," Voss said, his voice carrying easily across the silent crowd, "I want you to understand what you face. I have ruled this empire for 3 centuries. I have personally killed more enemies than your species has produced warriors. I am faster, stronger, and more experienced than any opponent you could imagine." David nodded grimly. "I understand. Then why do you not surrender? Why do you not beg for mercy?" The question seemed genuine, as if the Emperor truly could not comprehend David's decision to fight a hopeless battle. David looked around the plaza at the faces watching him. Humans, dragons, and dozens of other species whose lives hung in the balance. "Because sometimes the fight matters more than the outcome," David replied. "Because someone has to stand up and say that might doesn't make right, even when they know they'll lose." Voss tilted his massive head, studying David with newfound interest. "You truly believe that?" "I do." "Then let us see if belief can overcome reality." The Emperor moved with liquid grace, closing the distance between them in a single bound. His sword swept down in an arc that would have bisected David if the human had not thrown himself desperately to one side. The blade struck the deck plating where David had stood, carving a deep groove in the reinforced metal. David rolled to his feet and immediately had to dodge again as Voss's follow-up strike came from an unexpected angle. The Emperor was not just strong and fast, he was skilled beyond measure, his centuries of experience evident in every precise movement. For several minutes, David could do nothing but evade. Voss pressed his attack relentlessly, forcing the human to retreat across the plaza while the crowd watched in tense silence. Each near miss reminded David how outclassed he was, how easily the Emperor could end this confrontation whenever he chose. But as the fight continued, David began to notice something strange. Voss was holding back. The Emperor's strikes were devastating but not quite fast enough to be unavoidable. His positioning left small openings that a trained fighter might exploit. It was almost as if, "You're testing me," David gasped during a brief lull in the assault. Voss smiled, revealing teeth like ivory daggers, very perceptive. "Tell me, what do you think I am testing for?" "I don't know," David admitted, circling warily as the Emperor tracked his movement. "Then let me enlighten you." Voss lowered his sword slightly, adopting a less aggressive stance. "Every great leader faces a fundamental question. How does one distinguish between genuine courage and foolish bravado? How does one identify those rare individuals who will stand for their principles even when facing certain death?" David felt a chill of understanding. This whole thing has been a test. Indeed. The memory core was damaged but repairable. I wanted to see if you possessed the technical skill and intuitive thinking that our intelligence reports suggested. The puzzle box was solvable through logic rather than cultural knowledge. I needed to know if you could overcome apparent impossibility through persistence and creativity. And this fight? This fight tests the most important quality of all, character under pressure. Voss raised his sword again, but his posture remained less threatening than before. Many beings can perform technical tasks or solve puzzles when the stakes are low. But when everything hangs in the balance, when failure means death or disgrace, that is when we discover who someone truly is. David wiped sweat from his forehead, his mind racing to understand the Emperor's game. So what happens now? Now you demonstrate whether the Griffin's mark represents mere decoration or something more significant. Voss gestured toward the silent crowd. These people believe in you. My daughter believes in you. But do you believe in yourself enough to fight for what is right even when victory seems impossible? Something clicked in David's mind. This was not about winning or losing a physical confrontation. It was about proving that the values symbolized by the Griffin, protection of the innocent, resistance to tyranny, unity between species, were worth defending regardless of personal cost. David straightened his shoulders and met the Emperor's gaze directly. I believe in doing what's right even when it's hard. I believe in protecting people who can't protect themselves. And I believe that kindness is stronger than cruelty, even if it takes longer to show results. Prove it, Voss commanded. The Emperor's next attack was his most ferocious yet, a combination of strikes that forced David to retreat toward the edge of the crowd. But instead of continuing to evade, David suddenly changed tactics. He stopped running and instead moved toward Voss, accepting a glancing blow to his shoulder in order to get inside the Emperor's reach. For one crucial moment, David was close enough to strike. He could have aimed for the Emperor's throat, or tried to wrestle away the sword, or attempted any number of combat techniques from his military training. Instead, David did something that no one in the plaza expected. He embraced Emperor Voss. The gesture was so unexpected that the massive ruler actually staggered backward. David's arms could barely reach around the Emperor's scaled torso, and the size difference made the embrace look almost comical. But the sincerity of the action was unmistakable. What are you doing? Voss demanded, confusion replacing the predatory focus in his yellow eyes. Something my friends in the Griffin squadron taught me, David said, not releasing his hold. They showed me that the strongest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from turning them into allies. The plaza erupted in gasps and murmurs as beings throughout the crowd tried to process what they were witnessing. Lyra stepped forward from the circle of spectators, her scales bright with hope and determination. Father, she said, her young voice carrying clearly across the shocked silence. This is what I tried to tell you. This is why the Griffin's return is not a threat. It's an opportunity. Voss looked down at his daughter, then at the human who was still attempting to embrace him, despite the obvious size mismatch. You would show mercy to someone who just tried to kill you? You weren't trying to kill me, David replied. You were trying to understand me. There's a difference. The Emperor studied David for a long moment, then gently but firmly set him aside. Voss sheathed his sword and walked to where Lyra stood, kneeling down to bring himself to her eye level. You believe this human represents hope for peace between our species. I believe he represents the best of what any species can be, Lyra said. Human, dragon, or otherwise. He helps people because helping is right, not because he expects reward. He protects the weak because they need protection, not because he gains power from it. Voss stood and turned to address the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of absolute rule, but also something that had been absent before: uncertainty. For 3 centuries, I have maintained order through strength. I have expanded our empire through conquest and controlled our subjects through fear. It has been effective. He paused, looking around the plaza at the diverse gathering of beings who had made New Geneva Station their home. But effectiveness and wisdom are not always the same thing. Today, I have seen something that challenges everything I believed about the nature of power and the relationships between species. The Emperor walked back to David, who stood waiting with quiet dignity despite his obvious exhaustion. David Chen, Your Griffin's mark has proven to be exactly what I feared most. A symbol of hope that threatens to undermine everything my empire represents. But it has also shown me something I had forgotten in my centuries of rule. What's that? David asked. That true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to build. Not in the power to conquer, but in the courage to unite. Voss extended his massive scaled hand toward David. I hereby grant you and my daughter safe passage to any destination you choose. Furthermore, I declare New Geneva Station to be under Imperial protection as a neutral zone where all species may coexist in peace. David stared at the offered hand for a moment, then reached out and clasped it with both of his own. The gesture looked absurd, human hands barely able to wrap around a single draconic finger, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Thank you, David said simply. As the crowd erupted in cheers and celebration, Lyra ran to David and threw her arms around his waist. Her bear, still clutched in one hand, pressed against his back as she hugged him with all the strength her young frame could muster. The stories were true, she whispered. The Griffin's mark did bring hope. David looked down at the dragon girl who had started this entire adventure by asking him to fix her broken toy. Then he looked up at Emperor Voss, who was watching the celebration with an expression that mixed wonder with the beginning of understanding. Maybe, David said. Or maybe we just proved that broken things can always be repaired if someone cares enough to try. 6 months later, David's repair shop had become the unofficial embassy for the growing peace talks between human colonies and the Draconic Empire. Beings from across the galaxy brought not just broken machines but broken relationships, seeking the human mechanic who had somehow managed to repair the most impossible thing of all, the ancient enmity between two species. The Griffin tattoo on David's shoulder was no longer hidden. It had become a symbol recognized throughout Imperial space, representing not rebellion against authority, but the possibility of cooperation between former enemies. And in his workshop, surrounded by friends from a dozen different worlds, David continued to do what he had always done best, fixing the broken things that others had given up on, one careful repair at a time.